Chapter 23, 11th day of September 1680, Part 3. Mr. Dormer's voice carried up and over the again noisy crowd. "Swear in Mr. Fowler!" And when that was done, "Show him the book, if you please." Fowler took my book, held out to him, and turned it over. Mr. Dormer asked him if he did buy any of my books, to which Fowler said he had bought 2 for the sum of 4 shillings. He explained how some of his friends were pleased to joke with him that his name was in it. Fowler then related how, in particular, a visitor of quality, Mr. Henry Killigrew, came one day to his house and called him into the room, and there told him he was notoriously in print, and that he was known to be in the company of a great duke and great lords. So he had come to me to buy my book, and when I had bought the books to him, he had exclaimed, "Madam, I believe you had forgotten me." I had denied having ever seen him in my whole life, and he had become flustered when I further denied his claim that he was the man called F in my book, living at the Half Moon Tavern in Cheapside. Mr. Attorney General said, "You are the man meant by the F. Is there something in this book you are supposed to have done in the prison?" Again the Attorney General displayed knowledge outside of the courtroom with which he had led the witnesses. Fowler said, "I suppose Correll, the coachman, laid oath to that, but I also gave my oath for it before the Lord Mayor himself." The crowd, that I was beginning to see as a single angry beast, growled loudly at the mention of Correll, the coachman, and that growling swallowed up the Attorney General's voice. I could barely hear him from where I stood closer by. He gestured with his hands to quieten down, cleared his throat, and then said over the remaining grumble, "Pray, for the satisfaction of people here today, tell us what you know of this matter." Fowler squinted his eyes and wrinkled his nose. "The substance of my oath before my Lord Mayor was this. I never did see any of the things that she said in her book. No duke drew his sword, no lord proffered £600, nor did I whisper to the coachman that if he should name some great persons, then he and I would have money enough. The fact of the matter is that the book is a libel so dire." Baron Weston moved closer, perhaps to be better heard, and asked, "Was Correll, the coachman, apprehended for carrying away the dead man of Sir Edmund Berry Godfrey on your accusation?" Fowler said, "As to that, I will tell you that the occasion of all our discourse, if it may not be too tedious." Weston nodded, and Fowler went on. "One day, some gentleman in my inn called for a coach, but the coachman that came was made to wait too long, and so went away again, which the gentleman were not happy over. Thereupon another coachman was called, which was the man, Correll, mentioned in this libel. When he went upstairs to fetch the gentleman, they engaged him to stay, and to make sure he did so, secured his whip. While he waited," he raised his voice for the court to hear him. I doubted they did so even then, for there was such a to-do amongst them. "He came down to the bar and begged a pipe of tobacco for his wife, from my wife. Ay, she said, thou lookest like a good honest fellow, and I believe thou hast no hand in the plot," a common pleasantry at the time. Whereupon the man begins to tell her how he had escaped that danger. He swore damn to her that 4 men had accosted him at St. Clement's Church wall, and they would have him do no good and carry Sir Godfrey's body in his coach. He saw the body with his own eyes in a sedan, and loathing to be dragged in, shammed them that he could not carry him, for the axletree of his coach was broke. Overhearing the fellow talk, I came out from my room and asked him, "Are you sure of this?" He swore damn the truth of it, Then I asked him if he were master for himself or drove for another. The fellow, being sensible he had been too lavish in his discourse, pretended to light his pipe in haste and to run out and see if the seats of his coach were not stolen out. I took a candle with me and went after him, but by the time I got to the door he was already driving away, even though he had left his whip with a gentleman as security for his stay. Fowler looked to the court for their blessing, as he had done right by his questions. It was difficult to tell if they thought so, for they were too busy talking and jeering amongst themselves. The day after, Captain Richardson and the secondary of the Compter was drinking a glass of wine at my house, so I told them the story, whereupon the captain took the number of his coach that I had set down. They blamed me very much I had not stopped the fellow. Then, the next day, Richardson sent his Janissaries abroad and secured Coral. I believe they kept him in custody for 2 or 3 days. Baron Weston listened well, then asked, "When was this?" Fowler scratched his head. 2 or 3 days after the murder was publicly known. To the best of my remembrance, it was Tuesday night that this fellow told me the story, and the next day I told the captain and the secondary. Baron Weston said, "Was that Tuesday after the murder, or the Tuesday 7 nights after?" Frowning deeply, Fowler said, "It was a Tuesday 7 nights after. The next day I was ordered to wait upon the lords at Wallingford House, where the Duke of Buckingham, Lord Shaftesbury, the Marquis of Winchester, 2 other lords, and Major Wildman, the secretary, examined me upon this thing. And what I have declared to your lordships now, I declared with them. And they brought the fellow in face to face, and there he did confess the whole matter was told to him by 2 others. I wondered at that. If Coral had heard it from 2 others, surely Fowler this minute inadvertently proved his innocence. Fowler stopped talking when the crowds became too loud and he was drowned out. Weston turned to the persons making the most noise and waved his hands at them. But again it took Mr. Attorney General as well to hush them. Fowler, impatient for a gap to talk into, began talking regardless. The lords sent for the 2 persons Coral named, and were well satisfied they were both of good reputation, one of them keeping a victualling house, but they were of the opinion it was a mere sham, and that Coral merely named the first person that came to mind. Getting nothing out of him, my Lord Duke of Buckingham told him, "Sir, if you will confess, the king hath promised you shall be protected." My Lord Shaftesbury told him the same, but added that if he would not confess and tell them who set him to work, then nothing should be severe enough for him. Baron Weston cast the significance of this statement upon the court in a haughty look, his eyebrows raised so high they hid beneath his periwig. "Upon this accusation was he sent to the prison?" Fowler nodded. "He was reordered to Newgate, and there continued for several months." Baron Weston asked, "Were you ever in Newgate and saw him?" Fowler, "Never, not I." Baron Weston, "Did you never see him out with the chamber with the lords and at your tavern?" Fowler, "Never." Baron Weston, "Were you ever in Newgate with him, my Lord Duke of Buckingham, or my Lord Shaftesbury, or any other duke, lord or nobleman whatsoever?" Fowler, "No." Baron Weston, "Did you see any sword drawn, or money offered or laid down upon a table?" Fowler, "There was never sword drawn, nor any money offered." To the judges and then to the jury, Baron Weston summed Fowler's statements. He answers very fully to that and denies that Mrs. Cellier writes in her book that he is accused to be in Newgate in the presence of a duke and another great earl, that the duke drew his sword and the other nobleman laid down a great deal of gold amounting to £500. This is consequently denial of the whole charge. The room was filled with so many shouts and threats. I was enraged by their so despising of me. Though I should not speak, Weston having instructed me so, I could not hold my tongue. I did not write that this was true, but I writ that the fellow told me so. Baron Weston demanded that the Counsellor of the Crown should read aloud the passages relating to Fowler's story, and we were made to listen to them, for though it proved nothing, he said, compare it with the record, for she shall have a fair trial by the grace of Almighty God. Baron Weston. Now, I must inform you, Mrs. Cellier, we have already proved against the clauses in your book that cast great infamy upon our religion and on our whole government. Where you say Fowler was barbarously used in prison by nobles, first by drawn sword, next by the temptation of gold, in order to force confession, your words of their bad usage have already been proved false and libellous. Where you allege Prance was tortured in prison to compel him to commit perjury, he will prove against you this day. That you accuse the king of making it safer to be a hangman's hounds or to become an accuser for a pension is as public calumny on the nation, but then to say such things as it is not meritorious for a person to speak the truth than to do otherwise, this is a slander that ought earn public rebuke. Weston's demeanour became more fervent the longer he stayed on the stage. He played to the audience, but forgot that they came not to see him, but me. Mrs. Cellier has insinuated that the murder of the late King Charles I was sufficient ground to pervert her from Protestantism, when all the world knows that in that ill period there were Protestants that were far better subjects and more loyal than any papist was in the world, and there were those that suffered as greatly, nay, far more, for their opposition to the dreadful villainy that the papists can boast of, for their loyalty. It is well known that there were underhand villains that did encourage all that roguery, said Weston. He turned about and addressed me directly. You have set a fair upon the damnable lie that most arrant rebellious rogues that ever lived are great saints in comparison to Protestants. This no honest man will believe. I said they called themselves Protestants. I had to raise my voice to be heard. I know the Protestants were great sufferers for the king, and I myself felt it. My family were Protestants, and were several times stripped and plundered for their loyalty. I grant this. Weston, his face red and sweating with heat from both without and within, scorned. Do you? Then you are an impotent lying woman, or else a villainous lying priest has instructed you to begin your book with such base insinuation that the best of religion against the best of religions. This lie will go upon the public infamy attending your party of notorious liars, among whom falsehood does so much abound. Call Coral and Prance. In that way, Weston summarily dismissed me, and what I had to say. He took a white lace handkerchief from his pocket and wiped the drops of sweat that trickled from beneath his periwig. I clenched my teeth, surprised once more he had not pointed to my admittance that I wrote the book. His words had so prodded and riled the mob beast, barely held back behind the wooden bar, that it roared and shook and thirsted for my blood. I thanked the Lord that there were soldiers standing by, for it looked as if the bar might not hold, and I would be devoured by the beast clamouring for my throat. Swords drawn, the red-coat soldiers positioned themselves before the barrier, their armour easily deflecting the stones and small things thrown by otherwise unarmed audience. Their faces were not so defended, and I saw a woman reach forward and scratch at a soldier's cheek. He hit her hard with the back of his hands, so she fell against the man behind her. I could scarcely hear the first part of what Mr. Attorney General said next to the jury, but only the last, though I did not think any others heard as much. Give satisfaction. Jury should know. Does not concern the matter in issue, for in point of law, even the words of it be true, the publishing of a libel is a crime and deserves punishment. It did me no good, then, that I told the truth if the jury had heretofore judged my book. A libel resolved to find me guilty. My only hope was to prove I did not write the book, but the proof weighed heavily in the scales against me, and would not tip back lightly. Weston's shout over the din turned his already red cheeks the colour of good wine. But, Mr. Attorney, if we are to set a fine, it will be a satisfaction to the court to disprove the things that she alleges. Maybe you have witnesses ready. If he took offence, Mr. Attorney General did not seem so. He leaned sideways in his chair, then slow and offhand waved some empty pages to cool his face. The scorn in his voice showed a certain ill will that could only have found itself in encounters between them before. They are already ordered to be here. Swear Mr. Prance. His nose could not have risen further in the air without his standing. One judge beside him slept through the din with his mouth open. Prance was sworn in. Baron Weston was oblivious to the silent fought battle. Mr. Prance, pray, were you tortured in prison? Mr. Prance, whose haggard look was testament of either ill treatment or ill conscience, had changed his coat so many times he did not know what colour he wore. He changed once more. The puzzle was that he was called back to testify over and over, despite his faulty recollection or barefaced lies. No, never was in my life, he said. Weston asked. How then were you used? Prance said. Very well. I had everything that was fitting. Captain Richardson did take great care of me. A triumphant Weston said. The truth is, the very book itself implies a contradiction. It says these women heard in prison one strong man roar as a strong man in torture, and yet presently after that it says that the prisoner comes up in irons and is examined. Now any man that knows the nature of the rack knows how one so tortured could not even sit or walk, let alone have irons upon his legs. Surely some impotent lying priest dare venture such calumny. I did not say it was what happened, but that it was reported, I said, curious how he should so well know the result of iron when none such were ever allowed. I could not find myself surprised by Prance. I doubted he even knew the truth of any of it any more. He had turned about so many times he must spin. Mr. Prance slashed my words so that they were dropped. Dr. Lloyd was together with me many times for half an hour. If there were any such thing, it is certain he would have seen it. They needed no further facts from Prance, and Francis Corral was called. I covered my fast-beating heart with my hand, lest anyone should hear it. Again my fingers touched the cross beneath the satin on my chest, and I prayed no harm would come to Corral for speaking out for me. He was called a second time, but still he did not appear. It did not occur to me he would not come. Captain Richardson slapped some flying thing on his forearm, catching one end of his lace cuff from its fixing so it hung free, unnoticed by him, and came into the middle of the room to face the judges. "Last night I ordered Coral to be here today, but he is not here. His wife stands in his stead." Mrs. Coral came to the middle of the room with her eyes to the floor, as any good demure woman, or one that daren't do otherwise. When she stopped, where she should, before the judges, she hung her head, so all I could see of her from the side was her white cap and an ear. I did see how tight she held her bent form, a little more weight on her bones than last I saw her, clothed in a plain dress Cromwell would be satisfied with. Weston spoke with his back to her, facing the jury. "Good woman, were you ever with your husband in prison?" Mrs. Coral's head came up, and fear lived on her face like a parasite, making it twitch and grimace. She clenched her fist tight into her black Puritan skirt and did not look at me. "I was denied to see him when he was on the master's side." Weston turned so abruptly to face Mrs. Coral it made her start and look to the floor once more. "But when he came from prison, how did he tell you he was used? Did he tell you he was compelled to drink his own piss?" Mrs. Coral confirmed what I had said. "It was Sunday when they called me to bring him victuals so that he could not starve. They said he would be dead before I came there if I did not go fast. So fast I could. I bought him bread and things, yet I was denied to see him till near a fortnight after. Then I was amazed to see the great iron fetters he had on, for he could barely stand. How could he walk? They told me he had put on those things to keep him warm. I says to my husband, 'Lord, what have they done? You must surely have murdered somebody.'" Impatient for her to tell how they had treated her then, I asked, "Were you ever beaten for bringing your husband victuals?" Neither by glance nor gesture did she recognise me. "No, indeed no. I was never beaten, but they would not suffer me to see him while he was on the master's side." Did she lie before when she was comfortable with me, or now when she feared unknown retribution? To be sure, stories abounded of the wife or child of a witness stolen away during a trial that might be forced to do the bidding of the captor, so I did not doubt Mr. Coral refused to refute what I said, and now suffered for it some place behind a locked door. Perhaps he owed me his life, but what use was that, if it was again forfeit, until he was returned home safe? Would I have lied had it been my husband threatened so? Perhaps, but I was not so tested. It was as if the Lord Mayor had heard my thoughts and taunted me. He said, "We do not need Mrs. Coral. Her husband already denied everything in the book upon oath before me." "Mrs. Cellier," Weston ignored the Lord Mayor, "you should direct your questions through counsel at the appropriate time." Then to Mrs. Coral, "Was he ever hurt with screws or any such thing?" A small shake of her head gave me a clue as to how she would answer. No matter how tight I bound my voice, I could not stop protest and indignation releasing it. "Had he not holes in his legs?" Mrs. Coral said. "Yes, he had a great many. I did see holes in his legs." Weston was surprised. "Did you?" "I did see one," she said, "and I can bring the apothecary that bought salve to heal it." With false indignation, Captain Richardson stood tall as a mountain, legs parted and with his fists balled on his hips. "I keep no irons in the house that weighs 12 pounds. Weston scrutinised Richardson in a manner he refused to accord Mrs. Correll. "They say you have irons called shears that weigh 40 pounds. His eyebrows once more disappeared beneath his periwig. It seemed he had already heard of this from another place before he heard it from me. "If there be such a thing, I would be hanged for it before I go hence," said Richardson. "If I did not know the untruth of it, I might have been convinced by his conviction. The only way to refute his lies was to have my witnesses testify against him, but would they let me have them now?" "I hope I shall be allowed to make my defence and call my witnesses," I said. Weston's eyes narrowed on Richardson as if he still quizzed him, but said, "Yes, to be sure." He did not say more so. Shunning Weston's instructions, I used the moment to examine Mrs. Correll before she was dismissed. "You were present when your husband told me how he was ill-used. Can you state you did not hear him say he was fettered to the floor by a chain not above a yard long, and he was forced to drink his own water?" "Madam," she said, "he was not sensible of what he said." Ungrateful wretch! She still did not look me in the eye. I placed the danger to herself and her husband in one pan of the scales and my own in the other. They tipped dangerously against me. It was certain I would suffer for the truth, and would suffer more if she did not remember the facts to the court. "But did you not hear him tell me so?" "I cannot remember." Despite further questioning of her, she cast me an apology with her eyes, but did not redeem me. Weston shrugged the matter from his shoulders. "We need not hear more of this. Far the greater matter against you is the death of Sir Godfrey. In that you are tight with Prance's evidence, and turn scrutiny from your own party onto someone else, though I know not on whom, and so you would be bound to make the world believe that he was tortured into his confession, and that he was made mad when he did it." "Pray, my lord," I said, "hear me one word. As to your saying I do it to defend a party, I profess I stand singly and alone. I have been so barbarously used by those you call my own party, and the Protestants have been abundantly more kind to me than they. I would not tell the least lie to do them any good turn." I did not expect Weston to believe me, but if he did, it caused him great amusement. "Then you are a happy woman indeed, that is beloved by both parties. You have not been of good service to both alike, I am sure, but that is of no great matter. If the Protestants were so kind as you say, you have requited them ill by such base libel." "I say nothing against them." I held my head high and looked him in the eye. "Can you prove you did not write this book?" "My lord," I said, for this was a thing I knew from the Huguenot meetings I attended with my friend Mary Decimo, the outcast Protestants that escaped France readily accepted and supported some French Catholics, or those related to them, as was I. "I am not bound to accuse myself. I desire it may be proved." Baron Weston's derision was lost in the thunder of outraged talk that came then, but seeing his lips move and seeing his smile of satisfaction, I determined his words. "I think it is fully proved." If he thought I would cave so easily and allow him victory, he was much mistaken. "I cannot say anything without my witnesses. I desire I might call them," I said. Weston folded his arms across his chest as the loose lace cuff stood out white against his blue doublet. "Call whom you will." "I ask that George Grange should be called." Excuse me. George Grange was a small man with a nose suitable for sniffing mischief out of holes wherein it hid, or was concealed, that I paid handsomely to find my witnesses. I would that I did not call him, for he harmed me and did me no good. Weston soon had from him that my witnesses had gone either into the country or could not be found. Then he was turned against me. "Tell me what questions you will ask him," Weston asked me. "I desire to know the witnesses he went for, what answers they returned, and where they be," I said. Weston did not try to hide his disinterest and impatience. He tapped his still folded elbow with poker fingers and spoke from a thin mouth. "Well, what witnesses were you sent to look for?" Grange said, "I went to look for one Mrs. Sheldon that lives in Sir Joseph Sheldon's house, and they told me she was in Essex. Then I went for Mr. Curtis, but his wife did not see him since yesterday before the cock crowed." Weston flung his arms wide with exasperation. He asked, "What were they to have proved?" Grange said, "Truly, my lord, I do not know." Then Mr. Dormer asked, "By the oath you have taken, do you know if Mrs. Cellier sold any of these books?" Grange might be a hound for mischief, but it seemed he was also mischief himself. "Yes," he said, "I know she did sell some of them." They needed nothing more of him. My Lord Mayor laughed. "There, Mrs. Cellier, even your own witnesses proves against you." Those of the court that had heard him laugh at the irony, but I did not. Mr. Weston befriended me for some small moments then, for he took the court's derision away from me, though not through kindness, I was sure. "Who else would you have?" I thought to call my friend Mary, that came to give alms with me, but she did not appear. When I asked for John Clark to be fetched from the jail, Captain Richardson stepped forward, spilling hops from the cup in his hand onto the dusty floor. "He is in execution," he said. "For what?" said Weston. "For debt," said Captain Richardson. "The rule of the prison allows you to bring him hither." Captain Richardson shook his head. Uncertain if they wished it, he looked to Lord Mayor, who waved air at his face with a sheaf of paper. It did not at all diminish the sweat from his hot cheeks. "If your lordship orders it so, I will bring him." Lord Mayor was not so gentle on me as Weston. "She should have bought a habeas corpus if she would have had him." Mr. Attorney General that moment before had his eyes closed in sleep, as did two elderly judges, sat up sharply in his chair as if a servant had banged a door too loudly behind him. If he brings him without a habeas corpus, it will be an escape." I rested my hands on the rail and beseeched them. "I pray a habeas corpus to fetch him. I desire to have him come and defend something in my book." "What would he prove?" said Weston. I clasped my hands together before me, as if in prayer, imploring them to grant me this wish. "That I had not belied the government." "In what respect?" said Weston. "That he was shackled with long shears and unreasonable irons. I tried to come over with confidence, but when all I had trusted had already turned against me, I was not so sure that the veritable scoundrel John Clark would stand by me either." Weston said, "You apply too late. You should have moved the court for one ere now." My hope of any witnesses standing for me waned fast. I had no time to prepare for my defence," I said. "I did not have sight of the indictment till 9 o'clock today, and my counsel had not time to inspect it or speak with me about it." Mr. Lord Mayor lifted his quizzing glass, making his eyes bigger than should belong to his face, and peered through them at Weston. If we dally over this, at what time shall we have done? Baron Weston answered questions with question. Have you a blank habeas corpus here? The Counsellor of the Peace, I did not know the name of, spoke out. They should have to fetch it from the Crown Office. My counsel, Mr. Collins, came in on the discourse now. He told me, You cannot do yourself greater wrong than by such talk of this. I had no use for his advice, since he had previously informed me before the trial that all Papists are guilty of everything they are accused of. The crier suddenly shouted above all others, Here is Mrs. Smith now. My friend, Mary Smith, came forward into the room, her eyes down. She nodded at me before taking the oath. So relieved was I to see a friendly face that again I forgot that I should speak only through Weston. I addressed Mary directly. What have you heard Coral, the coachman, say about how he was used in prison? 'Tis as... Mary started, but Mr. Dormer cut Mary's first words from her gaping mouth and caused her to jump. That question is not to be admitted. Mary barely spared me a glance before returning her eyes to the floor and saying nothing. I could not judge her, for her husband kept the most vicious head cage, an instrument the likes of the one used to bully prisoners in Newgate, though there they called it by another name, discipline. One time I did see a woman that did not still have her tongue, and the spikes dug so deep that they drew blood, only for that she spoke her mind. It was common knowledge when Mary's husband had barbarously ill-used her with a scold's bridle, for her tongue would be too pained to take victuals or speak. Weston realised he should have said so himself and frowned. What would you have her asked? I held my head tall, and in the way he did not respect me before, I did not look boldly at Weston, but at the jury. I would have her tell what she heard the coachman say, for I only said he told me so. The moment I said it, I had not, though none remarked on the blunder of my owning my book again. But then they needed not if they had already weighed against me. Weston raised his voice high above it all. That is no evidence, he said, then louder. That is no evidence, I say, for the coachman might have been here if you had not sent him away. With that, Mary was dismissed. Shouts of laughter filled the room, so busy with noise that my ears buzzed. Nay, I did not. Let his wife testify I did not send him away, I said. Captain Richardson again stood as he had stood before, puffing up like a fighting cock. They have both sworn before us that she, he pointed an ironic finger fattened from his prisoner's pockets at me, gave them money and told them she would maintain them. He did turn my charitable deeds against me, twisting and turning the facts as they had heretofore. But I was not a priest that I could rise above such malice. I balled my fists at my side and spoke through clammed teeth to hide my anger. You are not an evidence against me. You are not sworn. The captain's smug smile did not upturn his moustache in the way a good smile should do. Any dubious kindness he had once shown was gone. But this that I say is already sworn, Weston said. Go on with your witnesses. They did not allow me to call Mary Johnson to prove her fruitless search to find my witnesses, nor would they have me have Mrs. Coral answer to whether or not I had sent her husband away, for they said it did not signify, since I could have done it without her knowledge. If they would not allow me prove my words, I did not know how I might defend myself. I could only cast myself on the mercy of the court now. I have done then, my lord, for not having time to get my witnesses, I cannot make my defence so fully as I would have done. I raised my chin with my hands once more holding the rail before me. I desire you to consider I am a poor, ignorant woman. I did not think further than publishing what others had told me, so if I had erred or offended, I have done so in ignorance." For the first time since we were in court together, Weston faced me equally, but his voice held only derision. "I do verily believe there are more wits than yours concerned in this book. Though you bear the name, I am sure you do not have the wit enough that it is yours alone. Though you acknowledge your part in it, by doing so, you are against the king, for you must know the king hath set out a proclamation that no books shall be printed without a licence." I had waited on one to say such a thing, though I durst not bring it to the trial myself, for I stood on quicksand with it. "I never heard it. I was under close confinement when the king set it out." Weston was triumphant. "No, I deny that. For you were set free the first day of Trinity term, and the proclamation came out towards the end of it." He seemed more knowledgeable of my business than I gave him credit for. I could not remember all of it, but I was certain he was mistaken in that. Trinity term ended the day after my release, and I was not out of the company of my husband and children all that day, and that was at home. "I was not," I started saying. "She does now confess she knows of it," said the triumphant Attorney General over me, "because she speaks of the time the king made the proclamation, yet that was before her book was written. She wrote her book knowing she did it against the king's will." I had verily set myself into a trap, and had been found in it. I looked to Mr. Collins, my counsel. I had nothing to lose by roping him in to aid me now. "I desire my counsel speak for me." Mr. Collins, that had yet done nothing for me, did nothing more. "I have naught to say for her," he said. He turned to me. "And if you had said less for yourself, it would have been better." The light shone in Weston's eye. He nimbly summed up my case. "He says he hath nothing to say for you, and so there is but one question, guilty or not guilty. The indictment is that you published this libel, and if the matter of it be proved, as is done, then what can counsel say but that you can disprove the witnesses?" "Well, my lord," I said, "then I beseech you consider that I am a woman, and deal with me in mercy as well as in justice." "Mrs. Cellier," said Weston, "I have said before, I have reason to suspect that though you bear the name on this libel, some of your wicked priests are at the authors of it. I'm not noted to use great severity towards man nor woman, whether or not your party. But when I see so much malice as is comprised in your book, then I think it not severe that you, who stand at the stake for all, must bear the blame of all. If you will tell us who assisted you in this wicked business, that will be something towards the mitigation of your fine. But if you will take it on yourself, you must suffer the consequences." "I beseech you, my lord," I said, clasping my hands together, "have some compassion. His Majesty acknowledged before the council that I had suffered for him. I lost my father and brother both in a day for him. And if you have no compassion for me, have some compassion, some commiseration for my loyal parents that lost their estates for him." If the judge had any kind of tenderness at all, I prayed my plea would blunt the severity of punishment on me, for now punishment was certain. I had not seen any kindness in any of them, nor did I expect any. Weston's next words proved me right. "If you have done service for His Majesty and thereby deserved dispensation of him, His Majesty would not fail to recompense you for it, for he is of a generous nature. But here we are to proceed according to the rules of law." "But pray have some mercy in your justice," I said one more time, desiring him to change his mind. I wrung my hands in anguish as he dismissed further words from me by facing my supposed 12 peers. "Gentlemen of the jury," he said, This gentlewoman, the prisoner, stands indicted. John Ainger, the indifferent juror, took off his unfashionable brown felt hat and clamped it to his chest in an apology. "Sir, we have not heard one word that hath been said." The courtroom thundered and roared with laughter and shouts as the words of the jury speaker provided them with new fuel. "Not heard?" Weston wore his horror for all to see. "That is extraordinary. Why did you not say so? It had been well if you had told us this before." Weston slipped a finger beneath the front of his periwig and scratched, jiggling it so it did not sit as straight as it should. "How very strange." The Lord Mayor opened and closed his mouth a few times, perhaps not thinking of anything to say before banging his gavel hard on the wooden block on the table. When that did not immediately quieten the courtroom, he resorted to standing and shouting, "Silence! Anyone not silent will be removed immediately." The Lord Mayor pointed to those that were noisiest, and the men-at-arms moved to take them out. They struggled and shouted, but the rest of the court became serious and quiet. Into that hush, Weston spoke again. "I will acquaint you with as much of the evidence as falls under my information. The business is this. She stands indicted here for writing and publishing of a very scandalous libel. But pray, did you not hear Penny prove that she sold it?" John Ainger said. "We heard the first 3 witnesses." "That was all that was necessary to hear. Therein was the proof of her libel." Nevertheless, Baron Weston took the next 10 minutes to explain in full what had gone before. He did not spare me as a villain most terrible in his summation. This time the court was listening. After naming the book as the libel, he placed the evidence into several parts. The first part, he said, was an insinuation against the Protestant religion, saying how I had turned from Protestants and accused Protestants of murdering the king, being the first King Charles, and other ungodly deeds. He asked by what right did I pretend that they were Protestants, and turned Papists when so many more of that religion adhered to the loyal party of the king. Then he took the longest part to describe how false was such villainous insinuation. A more rhapsodic speech he could not have made. Rather than nourish and teach seditious principles, he said, there was more fidelity, honesty, and generous trust amongst Protestants than amongst all the nations of the world. For it is not so friends in other places will be so better than our enemies here, he said, raising our countrymen above all others except the Germans that are famed for their honesty and integrity to one another. He then described the French and Italian, the Spaniards, or any other of the Levantine people as living like so many wolves, especially in those places that the Popish religion is professed. Pray, my lord, I say, I only called them Protestants, I said, for he had missed that part. He took no notice of this now, but clasped the front of his jacket and trod the floor before the jury and went on without a break in his words. Now, after this insinuation, there is another part of the book recited in the indictment. It is common knowledge that the Popish party labour mightily to cast the horrid barbarous murder of the magistrate Sir Edmundbury Godfrey off themselves and onto other persons. For the plot is a thing of so heinous a nature that, if it should stick, it would make a party so odious to all mankind. Mrs. Cellier has taken upon herself to tell the world that Prance, a principal witness, was tortured, and his evidence against those persons executed for Sir Godfrey's murder was false evidence extorted from him in gaol by ill and cruel use. As well you know, the laws of the land do not permit torture, the last of that kind being the Jesuit Edmund Campion, stretched upon the rack in the 20th year of Queen Elizabeth's reign. None other has been racked in any of the reigns since then, not in that of King James, nor in that of the first King Charles, and mighty God in heaven knows that there hath been none in this king's reign." At this, Weston stopped, turned himself to the jury, and held his hands wide with the full drama of holding the stage. He paused only briefly and then rode on. "Our government is the most lawful and merciful of any nation under the heaven. But here is Mrs. Cellier saying such ways were used against France contrary to the law. If this was so, why did she not proceed in a legal way against the persons she supposed made these transgressions of the law? Was it not her duty? If there had been such persons, she ought to have indicted them, for they are highly punishable for such extraordinary ways." Then Weston described the events of the day we heard Prance scream, of how Harris the turnkey said it was a woman in labour, then turned us away when we offered our help, and of how the jailers dared not tell what was the noise, but that they could not endure it, and how the prisoners heard him cry, "What would you have me confess? What would you have me belie myself? I know nothing of it," and such other words as these. "Whereupon we called Prance," said Weston. Weston then described how Prance was today questioned, and upon oath told how he was kindly used in prison, that he was under no compulsion, and that my book was a libel against the government. Then he recalled how Fowler had turned in the Corral the coachman for his part in the murder of Sir Godfrey, and how, on examination by the Lord Mayor before today, Corral had denied any threat against him in jail, or attempted corruption of him by the laying down of his £500, with the offer of more if he should confess. Weston walked to the middle of the bar, behind which sat the jury, and the spirit that made him passionately pace the floor moved his hands and face so that he became more animated. "And Fowler," said Weston, "testifies that he was never in jail with Corral in his life, never with him, nor with any nobleman, and he never saw any such cruel usage as Mrs. Cellier wrote. The whole story plays false. The last part of it, but the worst, Weston explained, was how I had defamed all persons in my libel, and monstrously defamed and scandalised His Majesty the King and his government. She wrote," he said, reading from his notes, "whenever His Majesty shall please to make it safe and honourable to speak the truth as it is apparent it hath been gainful and meritorious to do the contrary, their villainy will not want witnesses to testify the truth of more than she has written. She supposes that the king," he continued, "by the countenance of lies and giving pensions to liars, chokes the truth and makes it dangerous for those that know the truth to divulge it to the world, which is very vile scandal upon the king and the government." With his jaw clamped shut and the muscles of his cheeks bulging, Weston grabbed the bar in front of him, and like a man with a fever came so close he saw himself in each juror's eye. He had not heretofore shown such force of manner. "And that still is not the least of it," he said. "She said that she could have written more." The silence that followed this speech was not broken, as it had been throughout the whole trial, by shouts and laughter and persons in all places talking. It went on. In it all the eyes of the court came and rested on me, until the hatred and anger and desire for my death forced me to look down at my hands still clasping the bar in front of me. I could not bear to see them so openly exposed, and took them into my cloak. One of the judges put down his fan, and though the clunk of it was not loud, it was heard by all. As I feared was my heart beating in my chest. I had never so dearly desired the return of noise. I feared the condemnation in my very soul by every man and woman there would be upheld by the Lord, as he did all judgments made on earth, and I near fell to fainting. What had I done but good to deserve such reproach? It was perhaps not so long a time as I thought, for then Weston continued to talk as if that long silence had not happened at all. I lost hope. I could not in some way turn it round. "I must tell you this," Weston said. "These are the matters of the libel, in which the clauses are truly set out in the indictment. For I did examine them one by one. The proof of her ownership comes from 4 sworn witnesses. Downing, the printer, has testified that Mrs. Cellier said she wrote the book and paid for the publishing and correcting of the first 22 folios. Mr. Penny bought her book and asked her if it was hers, and she told him it was, and that she could have written more. Mr. Stevens, the messenger of the press, saw her sell her books on more than one occasion, and was told by the printer that it was her book. And Fowler of the Half Moon Tavern bought 2 of the books from her after he was told he was famous in it. Now you might doubt that she was the author of the book," he said, "but the manner she did own it at the publication by selling it as hers is to me under the notion of express evidence of the fact. I leave it to you as judges of that fact and expect your verdict in the case." I looked up to see Weston walk from the jury and return to the table where he had kept my book and his notes. Mr. Attorney General said, "There are 3 matters in the indictment. First, that she writ it. Second, that she caused it to be printed. And third, that she caused it to be published. Now, if you find her guilty of any one of those, though I think you have heard evidence enough for all, you are to find her guilty." Then Ainger, the spokesman of the jury, desired they may have the book with them. Weston said, "They can have neither the book nor any paper, else she will consent to it. Mrs. Cellier, will you consent?" I could see no reason for giving them anything they wished, if they wished to condemn me with it, so I said, "No." "Then they cannot have it by law," said Weston. The jury returned after half an hour, a trifling while to discuss the facts fully. They could not have had time to talk about any of it, whether they thought me guilty or not guilty. The counsel of the Crown asked, How say you, is Elizabeth Cellier guilty of the writing, printing and publishing of the libel for which she stands indicted, or not guilty?" "Guilty," said Ainger. There was a great shout of triumph and rejoicing. Did none care that it was not the truth that was tested, but only that I wrote about it? Nay, they would rather silence me. "She must stand committed to receive the judgment of the court," said Weston. "Will you give me leave to speak a word?" I had nothing to lose by asking. Now Weston had the answer he looked for. He seemed to be less hard. "I cannot give you any judgment, for by the custom of the city that is to be done by the recorder or his deputy. So you will say to the court what you will say to the court you must say on Monday when the sessions are done." I wished those that condemned me to hear my words, and so I spoke regardless. "What I would say is only this. I am a woman, and wherein I offended out of ignorance, and if the offence be mine, let not others suffer for me. Have mercy in judgment, and consider my loyal parents and relations, and the services they did His Majesty. Let his fault be wiped out by the service and duty I and my parents paid him, or at least let the punishment of this offence be mitigated in consideration that all my life, ever since I had first use of reason, I have been a loyal subject." "Those things will be considered on Monday, not now," said Weston haughtily over the jeers and taunts of the courtroom.